Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover crimes, secrets, and the darker realities hidden behind the image of Soviet order. Today's story is about violence in Dnipropetrovsk that, in hindsight, looked like a warning. Long before the 2007 Dnipropetrovsk maniacs shocked the world, the city had already seen a Soviet-era case that revealed something important. Violent patterns could grow in the shadows of order, and the system was slower than it should have been to treat those signs seriously. The clearest early example is Alexander Berlizov, a Soviet serial offender whose crimes in Dnipropetrovsk unfolded in the early 1970s. Later reporting and interviews with former investigators describe him as a worker at USSR, the giant strategic factory that symbolized industrial discipline and Soviet achievement in the city. The crimes were happening near one of its proudest industrial spaces, in a city closely tied to Soviet power and prestige. According to later accounts, Berlizov attacked women over a period of years and was eventually held responsible for 9 murders and dozens of sexual assaults. The crimes created panic in the city. Women became afraid to walk alone in the evening. Families tried to escort relatives home, and fear spread by rumor even when official information remained limited. One former investigator, Ivan Gledush, later recalled that the city filled with anxious rumors and that women feared going out alone at night. The public recognized a pattern even while the system still struggled to contain or explain it. This is where the warning signs begin. First, the crime showed how a violent predator could exploit routine Soviet life. The attacks took place in working districts near ordinary routes home, especially after late shifts. This was not spectacular criminality staged for attention. It was predatory violence hiding inside the normal movement of the city. That matters because it challenged the image of Soviet urban order. Second, the case showed how institutional assumptions could slow serious action. In one later interview, Gledush said a prosecutor initially refused to authorize Berlizov's arrest because USSR was a highly secret, tightly controlled enterprise, and people working there were assumed to be reliable. In simple terms, the status of the workplace shaped the way suspicion was handled. When institutions believe certain people or places are too respectable to produce this kind of violence, danger can hide longer than it should. Third, Berlizov reportedly participated in the very structures mobilized to hunt the offender. Later accounts say he was involved with volunteer patrol activity and had insight into the search atmosphere around him. The pattern is the same. He benefited from looking like part of the system rather than outside it. Violent offenders were not always outsiders. Sometimes they fit the expected image of normality so well that suspicion came late. The break in the case came only after persistence, survivor testimony, and recognition. In public space finally began to close the gap between rumor and proof. Later reporting says one surviving victim remembered enough to help narrow the search, and investigators eventually focused on Berlizov. He was convicted and executed in 1974. Legally, the case ended there. Historically, it should have been understood as something more than a closed file. It was an early demonstration that serial-style predatory violence could emerge in a Soviet industrial center and spread fear faster than official control could contain it. So why call cases like this precursors? Not because they caused later crimes in any direct way. There is no factual basis to say that one Dnipropetrovsk killer somehow produced another decades later. But earlier cases can still function as warnings. Berlizov's case exposed a pattern. Public fear grew before the system fully adapted. Official confidence slowed recognition, and violence exploited ordinary routines. Those are warning signs because they show what becomes possible when a society values the image of order more than fast, open acknowledgement of danger. That is part of what makes the later 2007 Dnipropetrovsk maniacs case so haunting in retrospect. It was not a Soviet case and belonged to a different era, but it erupted in a city and region that had already seen earlier violent shocks. In 2007, 2 young killers were eventually convicted over a murder spree in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. According to widely cited accounts of that investigation, the manhunt was initially kept secret, and the public was not warned about possible attacks or given suspect descriptions. It means one older lesson still had not been fully learned. Silence and delay can make a bad situation worse. Late Soviet and Soviet shadow violence was often treated as something exceptional, embarrassing, and inconsistent with the official picture. But earlier, Dnepropetrovsk cases had already shown that violent patterns could grow quietly inside everyday life. They also showed that the first signs often looked familiar. Fear spreading by word of mouth, institutions hesitating to believe the worst, trusted settings shielding trusted-looking suspects, and public warning arriving later than it should. That is why these cases mattered. They were not just isolated crimes. They revealed cracks in the Soviet promise of total order. The threat was not only the offender. It was also the environment that let the offender blend in, exploit routine, and benefit from delayed recognition. Once you see that pattern, the phrase, "worse things to come," stops sounding dramatic and starts sounding historical. The signs were there. They were visible. They simply were not treated seriously enough, early enough. In the end, the violent cases that warned of worse things to come were important not because they predicted one specific future crime. They mattered because they exposed a dangerous formula: fear beneath official calm, violence beneath routine, and institutions that reacted more slowly than reality demanded. In Dnepropetrovsk, those warning signs appeared earlier than many people now remember, and that is exactly why they still deserve attention today. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.